Sarah Chen had perfected the art of being invisible. At 32, she moved through the Sacramento Police Department's maintenance facility like a shadow, arriving each morning at 5:15 when the building was still wrapped in pre-dawn silence. Her footsteps on the polished concrete floors made no sound, a habit she'd never quite shaken from years when noise could mean death. The weapons maintenance bay occupied the building's basement level, a sterile environment of stainless steel workbenches and fluorescent lighting that hummed with the constant drone of industrial ventilation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah preferred the isolation. Down here, surrounded by the familiar scent of gun oil and metal polish, she could work without the weight of curious stares or uncomfortable questions about her past. Her workstation was a monument to precision and order. Every tool had its designated place, arranged with mathematical exactness that spoke of muscle memory, developed under circumstances where disorganization meant mission failure. Cleaning solvents were lined up by chemical composition and purpose. Digital calipers sat beside micrometers that she used to measure tolerances that exceeded department specifications by several orders of magnitude. A coffee mug bearing the faded logo of a local diner sat beside her computer, carefully positioned to hide the small scar on her left hand that formed a perfect crescent moon. Before the other staff arrived, Sarah would walk the entire facility, checking environmental controls and verifying security protocols with the thoroughness of someone who understood that preparation prevented catastrophe. She tested humidity levels because moisture could affect metal components in ways that most people never considered. She monitored temperature fluctuations that could expand or contract precision parts by fractions that seemed insignificant, but could determine whether a weapon fired accurately when someone's life depended on it. The morning ritual included brewing coffee for the entire department, knowing that arriving staff would assume the night security guard had prepared it. Sarah took satisfaction in small acts of service that went unnoticed, finding purpose in contributions that others would never recognize or appreciate. She understood that some forms of excellence were meant to remain hidden, their value measured not in recognition but in the lives they protected, through meticulous attention to detail. Detective Mike Rodriguez was usually the first to arrive, grabbing coffee with barely a grunt of acknowledgement before disappearing upstairs to his desk. Rodriguez had transferred from Los Angeles 6 months ago, bringing with him an attitude that suggested Sacramento represented a significant step down from his previous assignment. He treated everyone below detective rank as essentially invisible, which suited Sarah perfectly. Officer Janet Park followed soon after, her tactical boots clicking against the stairs as she descended to check on her service weapons maintenance status. Park was 26 and ambitious, fresh from the academy with dreams of making detective before she turned 30. She spoke to Sarah with the polite courtesy reserved for service personnel, never quite making eye contact but always saying please and thank you with mechanical precision. Lieutenant David Wong commanded the department's equipment division, overseeing everything from vehicles to communications gear to the weapons that Sarah maintained. Wong was a 20-year veteran who'd risen through the ranks via careful politics and an impressive ability to stay within budget constraints. He visited the maintenance bay once a week, conducting inspections that lasted exactly 15 minutes and resulted in reports that praised Sarah's work while demonstrating his complete lack of understanding about what that work actually entailed. Captain Lisa Morrison ran the department's training division, responsible for ensuring that officers maintained their certifications and met state requirements for firearms proficiency. Morrison had never served in the military, but she spoke about tactical operations with confidence borrowed from action movies and police procedural television shows. She treated Sarah's technical expertise as impressive, but ultimately irrelevant to the real work of law enforcement. None of them knew that Sarah Chen had once been Sergeant First Class Sarah Chen, United States Army Special Operations Command, with deployments that officially didn't exist in places that never appeared on any map. They didn't know about the classified missions that had taken her deep into hostile territory where American forces weren't supposed to be operating. They couldn't imagine that the quiet woman who cleaned their weapons had once provided sniper support for operations that prevented terrorist attacks on American soil. Sarah's movements around the maintenance bay carried the fluid efficiency of someone trained to function under extreme stress. She could disassemble and clean a Glock 19 in under 45 seconds, her hands moving with practiced certainty that spoke of thousands of repetitions under time pressure. When she worked on rifles, she used techniques that belonged in armorer schools rather than basic maintenance courses, checking headspace and timing with precision instruments that most facilities didn't even possess. Her computer workstation displayed maintenance schedules and inventory reports, but her browser history revealed deeper interests that went unnoticed by supervisors who reviewed her work. Technical manuals for weapons systems that the department didn't use. Ballistics calculations for environmental conditions that Sacramento rarely experienced. Part suppliers that specialized in precision components for applications that civilian law enforcement never encountered. Sarah's personal locker contained only the essentials she needed to maintain her cover as an ordinary maintenance technician. A spare uniform identical to the dark blue work shirt and tactical pants she wore every day. A lunch that consisted of the same turkey sandwich and apple she'd brought for the past 8 months. A small leather portfolio containing documentation that supported her carefully constructed background as a community college graduate, with certifications in gunsmithing and mechanical repair. What the locker didn't contain was any evidence of her true qualifications, or the specialized training that had prepared her for missions that required skills civilian law enforcement never developed. No photographs from her military service. No commendations or achievement awards. No contact information for former teammates who might compromise her new identity if they discovered where she'd ended up after leaving the service. The transition from military to civilian life had been more challenging than Sarah anticipated when she'd made the decision to leave Special Operations Command. She'd expected to miss the adrenaline and camaraderie of special missions, but she hadn't prepared for the sense of invisibility that came with performing work that others considered routine. In the Army, her expertise had been valued and utilized to its fullest potential. Here, her capabilities were not only unrecognized, but would be viewed with suspicion if anyone discovered their true extent. Sarah had chosen Sacramento specifically because it represented the kind of stable, predictable environment where someone with her background could disappear completely. The city was large enough to provide anonymity, but small enough that the police department operated more like a small-town organization where everyone knew their role and stayed within established boundaries. Perfect for someone who needed to blend in while maintaining skills that couldn't be allowed to atrophy completely. The morning routine included testing 3 randomly selected weapons from the department's inventory, a procedure that Sarah had implemented under the guise of quality control, but which actually served to keep her shooting skills sharp. The small range in the basement saw little use except for her daily practice sessions, which she conducted before the building's population arrived, and might ask questions about the necessity of such frequent testing. Sarah's groupings at 25 yards were tight enough to suggest exceptional marksmanship abilities, but she was careful to vary her performance enough that anyone reviewing the targets would attribute the accuracy to careful shooting rather than advanced training. She documented her test results in reports that Lieutenant Wong signed without reading, satisfied that the numbers fell within acceptable parameters for routine maintenance verification. The challenge wasn't maintaining her shooting skills, which were embedded in muscle memory that would persist for years even without practice. The real challenge was managing the psychological adjustment to work that utilized perhaps 5% of her actual capabilities. Sarah had been trained to operate in environments where split-second decisions affected mission success and lives of both teammates and civilians. Now she spent her days cleaning weapons for officers who would hopefully never face situations that required the kind of precision and tactical thinking that had defined her military career. Detective Amy Foster represented the department's newest addition to the investigative division, a transfer from the sheriff's office who brought experience with rural crime patterns that differed significantly from urban policing challenges. Foster was friendly in a genuine way that made her popular with support staff who were accustomed to being treated as essentially invisible by sworn personnel. Foster would stop by the maintenance base several times a week, ostensibly to check on her service weapon, but actually because she enjoyed chatting with Sarah about topics that ranged from local weather to current events. Sarah appreciated Foster's courtesy while remaining carefully non-committal about personal topics that might reveal inconsistencies in her background story. During one of these conversations, Foster had mentioned her frustration with the department's annual firearms qualification course, which she'd barely passed despite what she considered adequate shooting ability. Sarah had offered general suggestions about grip pressure and sight alignment, advice that seemed to come naturally but which impressed Foster with its technical precision and effectiveness. Officer Tom Bradley commanded the department's SWAT team, a 12-person unit that provided tactical response capabilities for situations that exceeded patrol officers' training and equipment. Bradley was a former Marine who'd served 2 tours in Iraq before joining civilian law enforcement, bringing military experience that made him the department's unofficial expert on tactical operations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Bradley's visits to the maintenance bay were professional and focused, reflecting his understanding that weapon reliability could determine mission success. He treated Sarah with the respect that came from recognizing genuine expertise, even if he couldn't identify the specific source of her knowledge. Sarah was careful to limit her interactions with Bradley, sensing that his military background made him more likely than others to notice inconsistencies in her cover story. The department's fiscal constraints meant that Sarah often worked with equipment that was approaching the end of its service life, requiring creative solutions to maintain functionality within budget limitations. She'd developed techniques for extending weapon lifespan through preventative maintenance procedures that went far beyond manufacturer recommendations, utilizing knowledge gained through military service where replacement parts weren't always available and mission success depended on making equipment function regardless of condition. Sarah's expertise extended to areas that civilian law enforcement rarely encountered, but which had been essential during her military service. She understood the ballistics of specialized ammunition types that could penetrate body armor or defeat hardened targets. She knew how to modify weapons for specific operational requirements that might arise during unconventional missions. She could fabricate replacement parts using machine shop equipment when standard components weren't available. None of these skills were relevant to routine police work, but Sarah maintained them through careful practice that she disguised as professional development. She subscribed to technical publications that covered advanced gunsmithing techniques. She purchased specialized tools with her own money, justifying the expense as investment in her current position while actually ensuring that her capabilities remained sharp enough for applications that she hoped never to need again. The isolation of the maintenance bay suited Sarah's need for privacy, while she processed the psychological challenges of transitioning from military service to civilian life. The work gave her hands something productive to do while her mind adjusted to an environment where hypervigilance was unnecessary, and every person she encountered wasn't a potential threat requiring constant threat assessment. Late afternoons brought different challenges as the day shift prepared to go off duty, and evening personnel began arriving. Sarah would conduct final inspections of weapons returning from the field, checking for damage or wear that might affect safety or performance. These inspections often revealed how officers treated their equipment, providing insights into training needs that she documented in reports that supervisors rarely read beyond the summary paragraphs. Officer Steve Martinez represented everything that concerned Sarah about civilian law enforcement attitudes toward equipment maintenance. Martinez treated his service weapon like a piece of furniture, bringing it in for cleaning only when required by department policy and showing little interest in understanding how proper care affected reliability. Sarah had tried to educate him about the importance of regular maintenance, but Martinez's attitude reflected the broader departmental culture that viewed weapons as tools that should work without requiring much attention or understanding. Detective Karen Thompson was more conscientious about equipment care, but her technical knowledge was limited to basic field stripping and cleaning procedures that she'd learned at the police academy. Thompson appreciated Sarah's expertise and occasionally asked questions about weapon modifications or accessories that might improve her shooting performance. Conversations that Sarah navigated carefully to avoid revealing knowledge that exceeded her supposed background. The evening routine included securing all weapons in the department's armory, a process that required careful documentation and multiple verification procedures to ensure that nothing went missing during shift changes. Sarah treated this responsibility with the seriousness that came from understanding how stolen law enforcement weapons could end up in criminal hands and potentially be used against the officers who'd originally carried them. After the building emptied and Sarah was alone with her thoughts, she would sometimes allow herself to remember what it felt like to be valued for capabilities that few people possessed. She thought about teammates who'd understood that precision shooting was both art and science, requiring dedication that most people couldn't comprehend. She remembered missions where her expertise had made the difference between success and failure, where lives had been saved by skills that were now hidden beneath a carefully constructed facade of ordinary competence. The drive home took Sarah through residential neighborhoods, where other veterans struggled with similar transitions from military to civilian life. She recognized the signs in fellow drivers who maintained excessive following distances, in pedestrians who walked with awareness that exceeded normal urban caution, in people whose posture suggested training that civilian life couldn't entirely erase. Sarah's apartment reflected the same careful organization that characterized her work environment. Every item served a specific purpose and occupied a designated location. No decorations except for a small American flag and a photograph of mountain scenery that held memories she couldn't share with anyone who might visit. The flag was folded in a triangle and displayed in a case that showed signs of careful handling, suggesting significance that went beyond patriotic sentiment. Evening news broadcasts sometimes carried stories about military operations in distant locations, reports that Sarah watched with professional interest while maintaining emotional distance from events that she couldn't discuss with anyone. She understood the challenges that current service members faced, having experienced similar situations during her own deployments, but her new life required that she observe from the sidelines rather than contributing expertise that might be valuable. Sarah's bedtime routine included security checks that were probably unnecessary in her current environment, but which provided psychological comfort that helped her sleep. Door locks, window latches, and alarm system activation became automatic behaviors that bridged the gap between military alertness and civilian relaxation. These habits would likely persist for years, reminders of training that had kept her alive in places where complacency could be fatal. Sleep brought dreams that sometimes featured scenarios from her military service, but more often involved ordinary situations that escalated beyond civilian capabilities and required skills that she possessed but couldn't reveal. She would wake with the sense that she was somehow failing in her duty by hiding abilities that could help people. But daylight would restore her commitment to the new identity that provided safety and stability, even if it limited her contributions to society. The morning would begin the cycle again, with Sarah arriving before dawn to prepare for another day of invisible service. She would maintain weapons for officers who saw her as competent but unremarkable, never suspecting that their equipment was being cared for by someone whose expertise exceeded that of most military armorers. The ordinary facade would continue, protecting both Sarah and the community that depended on her work without knowing the true qualifications of the person ensuring their safety. What Sarah couldn't anticipate was that her carefully constructed invisibility was about to be challenged by someone whose own military experience would recognize capabilities that couldn't be disguised indefinitely. The routine that had protected her for 8 months was about to be interrupted by circumstances that would test her commitment to remaining hidden, when her skills might be needed by people who had no idea they were in the presence of someone trained for situations that went far beyond civilian law enforcement parameters. The basement maintenance bay would soon welcome a visitor whose trained eye would notice details that others had overlooked. Someone whose own background would enable recognition of excellence that had been carefully camouflaged beneath layers of deliberate mediocrity. Sarah's world of careful anonymity was about to collide with the reality that some forms of expertise were too distinctive to hide from those who possessed similar qualifications and understood what they were observing. Tomorrow would bring changes that Sarah had spent 8 months avoiding, but which seemed increasingly inevitable as her need to contribute meaningfully to her community grew stronger than her desire to remain safely invisible. The balance between security and service was about to shift in ways that would challenge everything she'd built since leaving the military and starting over in a world that had no context for understanding what she'd sacrificed to be there. The first crack in Sarah's carefully constructed facade appeared during Officer Jennifer Walsh's quarterly weapons inspection. Walsh had been struggling with her service pistol for weeks, reporting that it pulled consistently to the right despite multiple adjustments by the department's contracted gunsmith. Sarah had examined the weapon twice, finding nothing mechanically wrong with the firearm itself, but Walsh's frustration was becoming a liability that could affect her performance in the field. Sarah watched Walsh attempt the qualification course through the observation window, noting immediately that the problem wasn't mechanical but technical. Walsh was applying unequal pressure with her support hand, causing the weapon to cant slightly during the trigger pull. Her breathing was inconsistent, and she was anticipating recoil in a way that threw off her natural point of aim. These were fundamental marksmanship errors that should have been corrected during academy training. After Walsh's third failed attempt, Sarah made a decision that would later seem inevitable, but felt dangerous in the moment. She approached Walsh during the mandatory cooling-off period, her voice carrying an authority that she normally kept carefully suppressed. "Officer Walsh, may I suggest a few adjustments to your grip technique? Your weapon is mechanically sound, but small changes in your shooting fundamentals might resolve the accuracy issues you're experiencing." Walsh looked at Sarah with surprise, tinged with desperation. The administrative consequences of failing quarterly qualification could affect her career progression, and she was willing to accept help from any source that might prevent that outcome. Sarah positioned herself behind Walsh, guiding her hands into the proper grip configuration with corrections that were precise and immediate. She adjusted Walsh's stance with small modifications that demonstrated deep understanding of how body mechanics affected shooting accuracy. Her instructions used terminology that belonged in advanced marksmanship courses rather than basic firearms training. "Focus on your natural respiratory pause," Sarah explained, her voice taking on the cadence of someone accustomed to instruction under pressure. "Don't force the breath hold or fight against your body's natural rhythm. Find that moment between exhale and inhale where your body is naturally still, and complete your trigger press during that window." She demonstrated the breathing technique herself, her body automatically assuming a shooter's stance that reflected years of advanced training. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who understood what they were observing. Sarah's posture, her grip, her sight alignment all spoke of expertise that exceeded civilian law enforcement parameters. Walsh attempted the corrected technique, her next 5 shots grouping within the qualification zone for the first time in weeks. Her face showed amazement that bordered on disbelief as she studied the target, unable to comprehend how such simple adjustments could produce such dramatic improvement in her shooting performance. "How did you learn all of that?" Walsh asked, staring at Sarah with new recognition. "That was better instruction than I received during academy training. Where did you develop that level of expertise with shooting fundamentals?" Sarah's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the brief moment of instructional confidence replaced by careful neutrality that had become her default response to personal questions. She deflected Walsh's curiosity with explanations about technical manuals and correspondence courses. But Walsh wasn't entirely convinced by the response. The second incident occurred 3 weeks later during Detective Thompson's evidence processing session. Thompson was examining a rifle recovered from a drug bust, attempting to determine whether the weapon had been modified for automatic fire. The examination required technical knowledge that exceeded Thompson's training, and she was making procedural errors that could compromise the evidence's admissibility in court. Sarah observed Thompson's methodology from across the maintenance bay, recognizing immediately that she was using outdated techniques that wouldn't meet current federal standards for forensic firearms examination. Thompson was documenting the weapon's condition incorrectly, missing modifications that were obvious to anyone with advanced training in weapon systems. "Detective Thompson," Sarah interjected quietly, "may I point out that federal guidelines were updated last year regarding automatic weapons conversions. The examination procedures you're using might not satisfy current courtroom requirements." She approached Thompson's workstation carrying printed documentation that she'd obtained through channels that Thompson didn't know existed. The federal guidelines were current and comprehensive, detailing examination procedures that most local law enforcement agencies hadn't yet implemented. Thompson studied the documents with growing concern, realizing that her evidence processing methods were indeed obsolete and potentially inadequate for prosecution purposes. "Where did you obtain these updated federal protocols?" she asked suspiciously. "These are Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives guidelines that haven't been distributed to local departments yet." Sarah had accessed the documents through military connections that maintained her security clearances for consulting purposes, but explaining that would raise questions about her background that she wasn't prepared to answer. She deflected Thompson's inquiry with vague references to professional development and firearms industry publications. The third revealing moment came during Captain Morrison's inspection of the department's tactical rifle inventory. Morrison was examining the precision rifles used by the SWAT team when she noticed modification work that exceeded the capabilities of most civilian gunsmiths. The trigger systems had been adjusted to competition specifications, and the barrel crowns showed machine work that required specialized tools and extensive training. "Who performed these modifications?" Morrison asked, studying a rifle that had been carefully tuned to precision standards that most law enforcement agencies couldn't achieve with their normal resources. "This is professional-grade gunsmithing that would cost thousands of dollars if contracted to civilian specialists." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks as she realized that her perfectionist tendencies had exposed skills that contradicted her official qualifications. The rifle modifications represented hours of careful work using techniques learned through military armorer training, but explaining that would destroy the anonymity she'd maintained for 8 months. I completed some correspondence courses in precision gunsmithing, Sarah replied, which was technically accurate but omitted the fact that her instructors had been military contractors who trained special operations armorers. The work seemed cost-effective given our budget constraints and the importance of accuracy for tactical operations. Morrison examined the rifle more closely, noting that the modification patterns were consistent with military specifications rather than civilian gunsmithing approaches. The trigger work was precise and functional, designed for reliability under extreme conditions rather than aesthetic appeal. Someone with Morrison's limited technical knowledge couldn't identify the specific source of the work, but she recognized that it exceeded normal civilian capabilities. "This is exceptional work," Morrison acknowledged, her tone reflecting professional appreciation mixed with confusion about how the department's maintenance technician had acquired such advanced skills. "You should consider applying for federal contractor positions that utilize this level of expertise." Sarah deflected Morrison's suggestion while mentally noting the need for greater caution in her future work. Morrison's recognition of her capabilities was flattering but dangerous, representing exactly the kind of attention that could compromise her carefully constructed new identity. The fourth incident involved Officer Bradley's tactical team during a training exercise that required precision shooting at extended ranges. Bradley's regular marksman was unavailable due to injury, leaving the team without adequate sniper support for a scenario that demanded accuracy beyond normal police training parameters. Sarah observed the training session from the maintenance bay's observation window, watching Bradley's team struggle with a simulated hostage situation that required a precision shot at 200 yards. The team's designated marksman was competent for normal law enforcement applications, but the environmental conditions and shot angle exceeded his training experience. After the third failed attempt, Bradley approached Sarah with a request that surprised both of them. His desperation to complete the training scenario successfully had overcome his normal reluctance to involve support personnel in tactical operations. "Sarah, I know this is outside your job description, but do you think you could take a look at our shooting setup? We're missing something fundamental, and I can't figure out what's causing the accuracy problems." Sarah examined Bradley's rifle configuration and immediately identified several issues that were affecting precision. The scope mounting was adequate for normal use, but lacked the stability needed for precision work. The ammunition selection was inappropriate for the shooting distance and environmental conditions. Most critically, the shooting position didn't account for the downward angle that was affecting bullet trajectory. "These are the adjustments I would recommend," Sarah explained, her voice carrying technical authority that impressed Bradley despite his own military experience. "The scope needs to be mounted with better hardware to eliminate movement under recoil. Your ammunition selection should be heavier bullets that perform better at this distance. The shooting position needs to account for the angle differential that's affecting your point of impact." Bradley implemented Sarah's suggestions, and his next shot hit the target center mass, despite environmental conditions that had previously made accuracy impossible. He stared at the target with amazement, realizing that Sarah's technical knowledge exceeded that of most military marksmen he'd worked with during his Marine Corps service. "Where did you learn ballistics calculations like that?" Bradley asked, his professional curiosity overcoming his normal courtesy about personal questions. "That was advanced marksmanship instruction that most civilian courses don't cover in that level of detail." Sarah's explanation about correspondence courses and technical reading was becoming less convincing with each repetition, but Bradley accepted her deflection while filing away mental notes about the maintenance technician, whose expertise seemed inconsistent with her supposed background and current position. The cumulative effect of these incidents was creating subtle but growing curiosity among observant department members, who were beginning to notice patterns in Sarah's capabilities that suggested more extensive training than her official background indicated. Detective Foster had mentioned Sarah's shooting advice to other officers, praising her technical knowledge in terms that made people pay attention to someone they'd previously ignored. Officer Walsh had shared her qualification success story, crediting Sarah with instruction that exceeded academy training in effectiveness and technical precision. Thompson had documented Sarah's knowledge of federal protocols in her case files, noting that the maintenance technician seemed unusually well-informed about law enforcement procedures that weren't normally part of weapons maintenance responsibilities. Bradley's tactical team had begun consulting Sarah informally about equipment issues that went beyond routine maintenance, recognizing that her technical expertise could improve their operational effectiveness. These interactions were creating a reputation for Sarah that was both professionally valuable and personally dangerous. The attention was exactly what Sarah had spent 8 months avoiding, but her inability to watch incompetence without intervening was creating situations where her expertise became visible to people trained to notice discrepancies and inconsistencies. Each helpful suggestion, each technical correction, each moment of instruction was adding to a pattern that suggested capabilities far exceeding her official qualifications. Sarah began implementing more careful operational security measures, limiting her interactions with sworn personnel and deflecting requests for technical assistance that might reveal additional aspects of her military training. But the damage was already done in terms of creating curiosity about her background and capabilities among people whose job required them to investigate anomalies and inconsistencies. The maintenance bay that had provided perfect cover for 8 months was becoming a stage where Sarah's expertise was increasingly difficult to conceal from colleagues who were trained to observe and analyze human behavior. Her helpful nature was conflicting with her need for anonymity in ways that seemed to make discovery inevitable. Lieutenant Wong had begun reviewing Sarah's work more carefully, noting that her maintenance reports were more thorough and technically sophisticated than anything he'd seen from civilian technicians. Captain Morrison was asking questions about Sarah's training background that suggested professional interest in utilizing her capabilities more extensively within the department. Even Detective Rodriguez, who normally treated support staff as invisible, had started paying attention to Sarah after hearing other officers discuss her technical knowledge and instructional abilities. The quiet maintenance technician was becoming visible in ways that threatened everything she'd built since leaving military service. Sarah realized that her situation was becoming unsustainable, but she couldn't identify a solution that would allow her to continue serving the community while maintaining the anonymity that protected her from people who might want to eliminate someone with her knowledge of classified operations. The balance between helping others and protecting herself was shifting in directions that felt increasingly dangerous. The breaking point was approaching, though Sarah couldn't predict exactly when or how it would arrive. She could only continue her daily routine while understanding that each interaction with colleagues carried the potential to expose capabilities that would transform her from invisible support staff into someone whose presence raised questions that she couldn't answer without destroying everything she'd worked to build. The basement maintenance bay remained her sanctuary, but it was becoming a stage where excellence was increasingly difficult to conceal from people whose training enabled them to recognize capabilities that exceeded normal parameters. Sarah's military background was bleeding through her civilian facade in ways that suggested revelation was becoming inevitable rather than merely possible. The moment Sarah had been unconsciously dreading arrived on a Tuesday morning when Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera walked into the maintenance bay, carrying a rifle that would change everything. Rivera was tall and lean with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years in harsh environments, his movements carrying the controlled precision that marked him as military even in civilian clothes. He wore the uniform of Sacramento Metro Police's newly formed Federal Liaison Unit, a position that brought him into contact with various law enforcement agencies throughout Northern California. Rivera placed the rifle on Sarah's workbench with the careful respect that professional warriors showed their primary tools. The weapon was a customized platform that immediately caught Sarah's attention, its modifications. Speaking of applications that went far beyond standard police work, the barrel was free-floated with a precision crown that suggested accuracy requirements measured in fractions of an inch, rather than the broader tolerances that civilian law enforcement typically demanded. This rifle was recovered from a federal raid last week, Rivera explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to briefing people on classified matters. We need a complete technical assessment to determine its capabilities and possible applications. The federal agents who seized it don't have anyone locally with the expertise to properly evaluate this level of customization. Sarah examined the weapon with professional interest that she couldn't entirely suppress, noting immediately that the modifications were consistent with special operations requirements rather than civilian shooting sports. The trigger system had been adjusted to specifications that would be illegal in most competition contexts, but were standard for military applications, where reliability under extreme conditions took precedence over legal compliance. The scope mounting system used components that Sarah recognized from her own military service, hardware that was restricted to federal agencies and wasn't available through normal commercial channels. The bipod system was designed for rapid deployment and adjustment under field conditions, with features that civilian shooters would never encounter or need. Rivera watched Sarah's examination with growing interest, noting that her assessment procedures were more thorough and systematic than anything he'd observed from civilian technicians. She was checking specifications that most people wouldn't know existed, using measurement techniques that belonged in military armorer schools rather than police maintenance facilities. Sarah began disassembling the rifle with movements that Rivera found strangely familiar, her hands working with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from thousands of repetitions under time pressure. Her technique was precise and economical, wasting no motion as she separated components with the fluid grace of someone who could perform the same task blindfolded. Rivera's attention sharpened when Sarah began examining the bolt face and chamber dimensions using precision instruments that exceeded anything he'd seen in civilian facilities. Her measurements were being recorded with accuracy that suggested understanding of how small variations could affect performance under field conditions that police departments rarely encountered. The moment of recognition came when Sarah reassembled the rifle in under 30 seconds, her hands moving with the automatic precision that Rivera had only seen among special operations personnel. Her technique was distinctive, incorporating specific procedures that were taught exclusively in military schools that trained elite marksmen for classified missions. Rivera's expression changed as he processed what he was observing, his professional experience enabling him to recognize capabilities that couldn't be acquired through civilian training programs. Sarah's rifle assembly technique was identical to methods he'd learned during his own service with Marine Corps Special Operations Command, procedures that were closely guarded and taught only to personnel with specific security clearances. "Excuse me," Rivera said, his voice carrying new authority as he stepped closer to Sarah's workstation. "That rifle assembly technique you just demonstrated isn't something you'd learn in civilian courses. Where exactly did you acquire that level of proficiency with military weapons systems?" Sarah felt her carefully constructed world beginning to collapse as she recognized the intelligence in Rivera's eyes, the professional assessment of someone whose own background enabled him to identify discrepancies that others had missed. His question wasn't casual curiosity, but the focused inquiry of someone who understood the significance of what he'd observed. "I've studied various technical manuals," Sarah replied, but her explanation sounded weak even to herself as Rivera continued to study her with the penetrating gaze of someone trained to identify deception and inconsistency. Her deflection wouldn't satisfy someone whose own military experience provided context for recognizing specialized training. Rivera examined the disassembled rifle components that Sarah had arranged on her workbench, noting that her organization followed military protocols rather than civilian gunsmithing practices. The parts were grouped according to function and reassembly sequence, in patterns that reflected institutional training rather than individual preference or civilian instruction. "That's not just technical manual knowledge," Rivera observed, his tone becoming more direct as his suspicions solidified into certainty. "You disassembled and reassembled that rifle using procedures that are specific to special operations armorer training. Those techniques aren't published in any civilian manual or correspondence course." Sarah's heart rate increased as she realized that her operational security had been completely compromised by someone whose own background provided him with the knowledge necessary to recognize capabilities that she'd successfully hidden from everyone else in the department. Rivera wasn't making assumptions or guessing about her qualifications. Rivera pulled out his phone and made a brief call to someone whose authority apparently exceeded local law enforcement protocols. His conversation was conducted in terms that suggested federal oversight and security clearances that went far beyond normal police work. Sarah understood that her situation was escalating beyond anything she could control through deflection or misdirection. "Sarah Chen," Rivera said after ending his call, his voice carrying the formal tone of someone conducting an official investigation. "Federal records indicate that you're currently listed as inactive military personnel with active security clearances for consulting purposes. Your background includes specialized training that's classified above the level of most civilian law enforcement personnel." The revelation that Rivera had access to federal databases that contained information about her true background shattered any remaining hope that Sarah could maintain her cover story. Her carefully constructed new identity was dissolving under the scrutiny of someone whose own clearances enabled him to verify facts that she couldn't deny without committing federal crimes. Rivera's demeanor shifted from suspicion to professional respect. As he processed the implications of Sarah's presence in a civilian law enforcement facility, someone with her qualifications and security clearances didn't end up maintaining weapons in a police basement without specific reasons that probably involved federal oversight or protection protocols. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Rivera said, using her military rank with the formality that acknowledged her true status rather than her civilian position. I'm going to need you to accompany me to a secure facility where we can discuss your current assignment and how it relates to federal operations that may be affecting this region. Sarah realized that her 8 months of anonymity were ending not through random discovery, but through systematic federal investigation that had apparently been tracking her location and activities. Rivera's presence wasn't coincidental, but represented some form of official contact that suggested her skills were needed for purposes that exceeded local law enforcement capabilities. The rifle that Rivera had brought for evaluation wasn't recovered evidence from a random federal raid, but a deliberate catalyst designed to force Sarah to reveal capabilities that federal agencies needed to utilize for operations that she couldn't refuse without violating her oath of service and her obligations to national security. Rivera began packing the rifle components while explaining that Sarah's technical assessment had confirmed federal suspicions about weapons trafficking networks that were supplying military-grade equipment to civilian criminal organizations. Her expertise was needed to help identify sources and capabilities that exceeded normal law enforcement knowledge. Sarah understood that her transition from invisible maintenance technician to federal consultant was happening whether she cooperated willingly or was compelled by authorities whose jurisdiction superseded her personal preferences for anonymity. Her skills were apparently essential for investigations that couldn't proceed without someone who possessed her specific qualifications and experience. The basement maintenance bay that had provided sanctuary for 8 months was transforming into a staging area for Sarah's return to the world of classified operations and federal responsibility. Her carefully constructed civilian identity was being replaced by her true military status in ways that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Rivera's presence represented the collision between Sarah's desire for ordinary life and her obligations to serve national security interests that couldn't be ignored when her unique capabilities were required. The balance between personal safety and professional duty was shifting in directions that would define the next phase of her life. As Rivera prepared to escort Sarah from the building, she realized that her attempt to disappear into civilian anonymity had been monitored and managed by federal agencies that had always known her location and activities. Her freedom to choose ordinary life had been temporary, conditional on circumstances that apparently no longer permitted her to remain hidden. The transformation from Sarah Chen, maintenance technician, back to Staff Sergeant Chen, special operations specialist, was happening with bureaucratic efficiency that suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous discovery. Her military career wasn't ended but merely suspended, waiting for situations that required her return to active status. Sarah gathered her personal items while understanding that her next assignment would probably involve the same kinds of classified operations that had originally led to her need for protected status. Her skills were too valuable and too rare for federal agencies to allow her permanent retirement when national security situations demanded her expertise. Rivera held the door as Sarah left the maintenance bay that had been her refuge, her footsteps echoing differently now that her true identity was no longer secret. The invisible woman was becoming visible again, not by choice but by necessity, that superseded personal preferences when the mission required capabilities that only she possessed. 6 months after Rivera's visit transformed Sarah's world, she stood in the briefing room of a federal facility that didn't appear on any public maps, addressing a joint task force that included representatives from agencies whose acronyms were classified above most security clearances. The woman who had once hidden her capabilities in a police basement now commanded attention from the highest levels of national security infrastructure. Sarah's new role as Senior Technical Advisor for Counterterrorism Weapons Analysis had evolved from the weapons trafficking investigation that Rivera had initiated. Her expertise in identifying modified military equipment had proven invaluable in tracking sophisticated criminal networks that were supplying advanced weaponry to domestic terrorist organizations and foreign intelligence operations. The briefing room's occupants represented a convergence of federal law enforcement and military intelligence that reflected the scope of threats Sarah's work had helped identify. Agent Patricia Hayes from the FBI's Counterterrorism Division sat beside Colonel James Liu from Defense Intelligence Agency, while Director Michelle Santos from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives reviewed classified documents that Sarah's technical assessments had made possible. The weapons trafficking network we've been investigating extends far beyond simple criminal enterprise, Sarah explained, her presentation displaying evidence that connected seemingly isolated incidents across multiple states into a coherent pattern of coordinated operations. These organizations are receiving military-grade equipment through channels that suggest institutional compromise rather than opportunistic theft. Sarah's analysis had revealed that the rifle Rivera brought to her attention was part of a systematic diversion program that involved active military personnel, defense contractors, and civilian criminal organizations working in coordination to supply advanced weaponry to groups planning attacks on American infrastructure and government facilities. Her technical expertise had enabled federal agencies to identify modification patterns and manufacturing signatures that connected weapons seized in different investigations, revealing a network that spanned from military bases in the Southwest to urban criminal organizations in major metropolitan areas throughout the country. Agent Hayes studied Sarah's documentation with professional appreciation for thoroughness that exceeded anything she'd encountered during 20 years of federal investigation. Sarah's ability to extract intelligence from weapons evidence had transformed how counterterrorism agencies approached technical analysis of recovered equipment. "Your assessment capabilities have revolutionized our understanding of how advanced weaponry reaches criminal hands," Hayes acknowledged, her tone reflecting genuine respect for Sarah's contributions to investigations that had prevented multiple terrorist attacks. "The modification signatures you've identified have enabled us to trace weapons back to their sources in ways that weren't possible before your involvement." Sarah's transition from hidden maintenance technician to federal consultant had required psychological adjustments that proved more challenging than the technical aspects of her new responsibilities. After 8 months of enforced invisibility, resuming her role as a recognized expert in classified operations demanded rebuilding confidence that had been suppressed during her civilian hiatus. The federal facility where Sarah now worked represented everything she'd avoided during her attempt at ordinary life. Security protocols that required multiple clearances for basic movement. Classified briefings that couldn't be discussed with anyone outside the facility. Operational planning for missions that officially didn't exist and would never appear in public records. Colonel Liu had become Sarah's primary liaison with military intelligence operations that required her expertise in evaluating captured equipment from overseas sources. Her ability to identify modifications that indicated specific training origins had proven valuable in tracking weapons and tactics that foreign intelligence services were providing to proxy organizations. Sarah's workstation occupied a secure laboratory that contained equipment exceeding anything available to civilian law enforcement agencies. Precision measurement tools, ballistics testing equipment, and computer systems with processing capabilities that enabled analysis of weapons modifications at the molecular level. The technical challenges of her new position engaged Sarah's expertise in ways that civilian police work never could. She was analyzing weapons systems that represented cutting-edge military technology, identifying countermeasures that enemy organizations were developing to defeat American tactical advantages, and providing intelligence that affected strategic planning at the highest levels of government. Sarah's personal life had undergone corresponding transformation, as her federal position required relocating to secure housing that provided protection against retaliation from criminal organizations whose operations she'd helped disrupt. Her apartment was monitored by security systems that exceeded anything she'd experienced during her previous witness protection status. The isolation that came with her new clearance level was more complete than anything she'd experienced during her civilian hiatus. Her work couldn't be discussed with anyone outside her professional circle, and her social interactions were limited to colleagues who shared similar security restrictions and understood the psychological challenges of classified employment. Director Santos had assigned Sarah to lead a new initiative that would train federal agents and military personnel in advanced weapons identification techniques, sharing her expertise with investigators who needed to recognize modifications and capabilities that exceeded normal training parameters. The teaching component of Sarah's position reconnected her with the satisfaction of sharing knowledge with people who could utilize it effectively. Her instruction methods incorporated lessons learned from her military service with insights gained during her civilian experience, creating training programs that bridged the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Sarah's classes attracted students from agencies throughout the federal intelligence community, law enforcement officers whose investigations required technical expertise that wasn't available through normal channels, and military personnel who needed to understand enemy capabilities that were evolving faster than traditional intelligence could track. Her reputation within the federal law enforcement community had grown beyond her technical expertise to include recognition as someone who understood the psychological challenges of transitioning between military and civilian roles. Other veterans sought her guidance about managing careers that required maintaining classified capabilities while integrating into civilian society. The Sacramento Police Department had undergone its own transformation following Sarah's departure, with federal oversight that had identified systemic problems in equipment management and personnel vetting. Her replacement was a retired military armorer, whose qualifications were thoroughly verified before appointment, ensuring that weapons maintenance would continue at standards that Sarah had established. Officer Walsh had been promoted to training coordinator, utilizing shooting instruction techniques that Sarah had taught her to improve departmental marksmanship standards. Detective Thompson had transferred to the federal task force that Sarah helped coordinate, bringing investigative experience that complemented Sarah's technical expertise. Rivera had become Sarah's primary field liaison, coordinating between federal agencies and local law enforcement when investigations required technical analysis that only Sarah could provide. Their professional relationship had evolved into mutual respect based on shared understanding of classified operations and the personal costs of maintaining security clearances. The weapons trafficking network that had precipitated Sarah's emergence from anonymity had been systematically dismantled through investigations that her technical analysis had made possible. Dozens of arrests had disrupted criminal organizations across multiple states, preventing attacks that could have resulted in significant casualties and infrastructure damage. Federal prosecutors had secured convictions that demonstrated the effectiveness of Sarah's analytical methods, establishing legal precedents for using technical weapons analysis in terrorism prosecutions. Her expert testimony had proven compelling in court proceedings that involved classified evidence and national security implications. Sarah's work had also contributed to policy changes that strengthened security protocols for military equipment and defense contractor oversight. Her insights into how advanced weaponry reached criminal hands had informed legislative initiatives that closed regulatory gaps and enhanced accountability measures. The personal cost of Sarah's return to classified work included accepting that her experiment with ordinary life had been temporary rather than permanent. Her skills were too specialized and too valuable for national security agencies to permit retirement when emerging threats required capabilities that few people possessed. Sarah's evening routine now included secure communications with field agents, who needed technical consultation about weapons recovered during ongoing investigations. Her expertise had become essential for operations that couldn't proceed without someone who understood the implications of modifications that exceeded normal analytical capabilities. The federal facility's gymnasium provided opportunities for Sarah to maintain physical conditioning that her position required, training alongside other personnel whose assignments demanded readiness for situations that could escalate beyond analytical work into operational deployment. Sarah's apartment contained equipment that enabled her to continue learning about emerging weapons technologies and modification techniques that criminal organizations were developing to stay ahead of law enforcement detection methods. Her professional development was ongoing, requiring constant adaptation to threats that evolved faster than institutional responses. Weekend assignments often involved traveling to investigation sites where local law enforcement had recovered weapons that exceeded their analytical capabilities. Sarah's field assessments provided real-time intelligence that enabled tactical decisions about how to proceed with arrests and evidence collection. Her federal position had restored Sarah's sense of purpose in ways that civilian employment couldn't match. She was contributing meaningfully to national security objectives that aligned with her training and experience, utilizing capabilities that civilian life had forced her to suppress. The recognition that came with her federal role was professionally satisfying while personally challenging. Sarah was appreciated for expertise that she'd hidden for 8 months, but the visibility that came with recognition increased risks that had originally driven her to seek anonymity. Federal protection protocols now managed threats against Sarah that were more sophisticated than anything she'd faced during her previous witness protection status. Criminal organizations that she'd helped investigate possessed resources and capabilities that made retaliation attempts more likely and potentially more dangerous. Sarah's daily security briefings included updates about organizations that had been disrupted by investigations that her work had supported. The intelligence regarding potential threats required constant vigilance that exceeded anything she'd experienced during civilian life, but the protection measures were correspondingly more comprehensive. Her personal relationships were limited to colleagues who understood the constraints of classified employment and the security concerns that affected anyone whose work disrupted organized criminal operations. Dating was complicated by security clearance requirements and the need to avoid personal connections that could create vulnerability. Sarah's family communications were monitored and restricted to ensure that her location and activities couldn't be compromised through inadvertent disclosure. Her parents understood that her work required security measures, but they couldn't be informed about specific threats or protection protocols. The federal facility's recreational activities included social events for personnel whose security requirements created isolation from civilian social networks. These gatherings provided opportunities for relationships with people who shared similar professional constraints and understood the psychological challenges of classified employment. Sarah's career trajectory within the federal system offered advancement opportunities that civilian employment couldn't match. Her expertise was increasingly recognized at policy levels that affected national security strategy, providing influence over decisions that would shape how emerging threats were addressed. The technical challenges of her position continued to evolve as criminal organizations developed more sophisticated methods for acquiring and modifying military equipment. Sarah's analytical capabilities were constantly tested by weapons systems that pushed the boundaries of what civilian law enforcement typically encountered. Her teaching responsibilities had expanded to include international training programs that shared American weapons identification expertise, with allied nations facing similar threats from criminal organizations that operated across national boundaries. These assignments required travel to secure facilities in countries whose security partnerships with the United States included intelligence sharing about weapons trafficking. Sarah's expertise had become valuable beyond federal agencies, to include defense contractors who needed consultation about how their products might be modified by unauthorized users. Her insights informed design changes that made military equipment more resistant to criminal modification, while maintaining operational effectiveness for authorized users. The transformation from invisible maintenance technician to recognized federal expert represented more than career advancement for Sarah. Her experience demonstrated that excellence often remained hidden until circumstances required revelation, and that some capabilities were too valuable to remain permanently concealed. Her story had become an example within federal training programs about recognizing talent that might be overlooked due to assumptions about credentials or positions. Sarah's emergence from anonymity had challenged institutional thinking about how expertise was identified and utilized within government agencies. The weapons maintenance bay, where Sarah had hidden her capabilities for 8 months, had been converted into a training facility where federal agents learned to recognize signs of advanced technical knowledge that might indicate personnel whose qualifications exceeded their apparent positions. Sarah's legacy within the Sacramento Police Department included enhanced security protocols for personnel vetting and equipment management that prevented the kind of anonymity that had enabled her to remain undetected. These changes ensured that qualified personnel would be recognized and appropriately utilized rather than overlooked. Her federal position had evolved to include consulting responsibilities that affected policy development at the highest levels of government. Sarah's technical expertise informed strategic planning that addressed emerging threats and the evolving capabilities of criminal organizations that targeted American interests. The invisible woman had become permanently visible, her capabilities recognized and utilized at levels that matched their significance for national security. Sarah's transition from hidden service to acknowledged expertise represented the completion of a journey that had tested her commitment to duty while validating the importance of recognizing talent regardless of where it chose to serve. 2 years into her federal career, Sarah stood before an international conference of counterterrorism specialists in Geneva, delivering a presentation that would fundamentally change how allied nations approached weapons trafficking intelligence. The auditorium contained representatives from 43 countries, each facing threats from criminal organizations that were becoming increasingly sophisticated in their acquisition and modification of military-grade equipment. Sarah's research had revealed patterns that connected weapons trafficking networks across continents, demonstrating that what appeared to be isolated criminal enterprises were actually coordinated operations funded and directed by state actors seeking to destabilize democratic governments through proxy violence. Her technical analysis had provided the evidence necessary to expose these connections and develop coordinated international responses. The presentation included case studies from investigations that Sarah had led, showing how technical analysis of recovered weapons could reveal manufacturing origins, modification techniques, and distribution networks that traditional intelligence methods had failed to identify. Her methodology was being adopted by law enforcement agencies worldwide as the new standard for weapons forensics. Dr. Andreas Müller from the German Federal Criminal Police Office approached Sarah after her presentation, his expression reflecting professional admiration mixed with concern about the implications of her findings. "Your analysis suggests that the threats we're facing are far more coordinated than our individual agencies have recognized," he observed. "The level of technical sophistication you've documented requires resources that only state actors possess." Sarah's evidence had indeed revealed that several nations were using criminal proxies to conduct asymmetric warfare against Western democracies, providing advanced weapons and training to terrorist organizations while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. The technical signatures she'd identified were too consistent across different regions to represent coincidental criminal innovation. Inspector Marie Dubois from the French National Police presented challenges that her agency was facing with weapons that exceeded anything they'd previously encountered. Sarah's consultation had become essential for investigations throughout Europe, where criminal organizations were acquiring equipment that suggested military supply chains rather than black market opportunism. "The weapons modifications you've taught us to recognize have appeared in 12 different countries over the past 6 months," Dubois explained, displaying photographs that showed identical technical signatures across weapons recovered from separate investigations. "The coordination this represents is beyond anything we've seen from traditional criminal networks." Sarah's training programs had equipped investigators with knowledge that was proving invaluable as criminal organizations escalated their capabilities beyond civilian law enforcement norms. Her instruction methods combined technical expertise with tactical awareness that enabled field agents to recognize threats that exceeded their normal training parameters. Commander James Mitchell from Scotland Yard's Counter-Terrorism Command had implemented Sarah's analytical protocols throughout British law enforcement, resulting in arrests that disrupted planned attacks on infrastructure targets throughout the United Kingdom. The intelligence developed through weapons analysis had prevented casualties that could have numbered in the hundreds. "Your methodology has transformed our understanding of how these organizations operate," Mitchell acknowledged during the conference's technical session. "The weapons intelligence we're now collecting provides insights into their capabilities and intentions that conventional surveillance couldn't achieve." Sarah's influence extended beyond law enforcement to include defense contractors who were redesigning equipment to resist unauthorized modification while maintaining operational effectiveness for legitimate users. Her insights into how criminal organizations modified military equipment had informed engineering changes that would make future weapons trafficking more difficult. The conference included classified sessions where Sarah briefed intelligence officials about threats that couldn't be discussed in public forums. These presentations revealed the scope of state-sponsored weapons trafficking that was targeting democratic institutions worldwide, requiring coordinated responses that exceeded individual national capabilities. General Patricia Wilson from NATO's Counterintelligence Division had requested Sarah's assessment of weapons patterns that suggested coordinated attacks on alliance infrastructure. The technical evidence indicated that multiple nations were collaborating to provide criminal organizations with capabilities specifically designed to target democratic governments and military installations. Sarah's analysis had become essential for strategic planning at the highest levels of international security cooperation. Her ability to connect technical evidence with geopolitical patterns provided intelligence that informed policy decisions about sanctions, military aid, and diplomatic responses to state-sponsored terrorism. The personal cost of Sarah's international prominence included security measures that exceeded anything she'd experienced during her previous federal protection. Her expertise had made her a target for elimination by multiple criminal organizations and hostile intelligence services that viewed her work as a significant threat to their operations. Sarah's daily routine now included protection protocols that monitored threats from sources ranging from individual criminal organizations to state intelligence services. The security requirements affected every aspect of her life, from housing arrangements to travel procedures to communication methods that required constant encryption and counter-surveillance measures. Her apartment was located within a secure compound that housed other federal personnel whose work created similar security risks. The facility included amenities that enabled normal social interaction while maintaining protection protocols that prevented unauthorized access or surveillance by hostile organizations. Sarah's personal relationships were complicated by security requirements that made casual social interaction impossible. Dating required background investigations that few people were willing to undergo, and friendships were limited to colleagues who understood the constraints of classified employment and high-risk assignments. The isolation that came with her position was offset by professional satisfaction that exceeded anything she'd experienced during her military service. Sarah was contributing to international security cooperation that protected millions of people from terrorist attacks that her work had helped prevent. Her teaching responsibilities had expanded to include instruction at military academies and intelligence training centers throughout Allied nations. Sarah's courses were considered essential preparation for officers who would face threats that exceeded traditional warfare parameters and required understanding of how criminal organizations acquired and utilized advanced weapons. The students in Sarah's international programs included personnel from special operations units, intelligence agencies, and law enforcement organizations that needed expertise in recognizing and countering weapons trafficking networks. Her instruction methods had been refined through experience with diverse audiences whose operational requirements varied significantly. Lieutenant Colonel Sophie Anderson from the Swedish Armed Forces had completed Sarah's advanced course and implemented her analytical methods throughout Scandinavian military intelligence cooperation. The techniques had proven valuable in tracking weapons flows from Eastern European criminal organizations that were supplying terrorist groups throughout the region. "Your training has provided our analysts with capabilities that we didn't know we needed," Anderson explained during a follow-up consultation that Sarah conducted at a secure facility outside Stockholm. "The technical patterns you've taught us to recognize have revealed connections between incidents that we previously considered unrelated." Sarah's methodology was being incorporated into intelligence sharing agreements that enabled Allied nations to coordinate responses to weapons trafficking networks that operated across national boundaries. Her technical analysis provided the evidence necessary to justify military and law enforcement operations that required international cooperation. The weapons trafficking investigation that had originally brought Sarah to federal attention had expanded into a global counterterrorism operation that involved dozens of countries and resulted in thousands of arrests. Her technical expertise had provided the foundation for intelligence cooperation that dismantled networks spanning multiple continents. Federal prosecutors in the United States had secured convictions that established legal precedents for prosecuting state-sponsored terrorism, using evidence that Sarah's analysis had developed to prove coordination between hostile governments and criminal organizations. These cases had significant implications for international law and diplomatic relations. Sarah's expert testimony had been crucial in proceedings before international courts that addressed state responsibility for terrorist attacks conducted by proxy organizations. Her technical evidence provided proof of government involvement that couldn't be dismissed as circumstantial or speculative. The policy implications of Sarah's work extended to sanctions regimes that targeted nations providing weapons and training to terrorist organizations. Her analysis had informed economic measures that disrupted funding sources and supply chains that supported international terrorism. Defense contractors throughout Allied nations had modified their products based on Sarah's insights into how criminal organizations were adapting military equipment for terrorist applications. These engineering changes had made weapons trafficking more difficult while maintaining functionality for legitimate military users. Sarah's influence on international security cooperation included participation in policy development that would shape responses to emerging threats for decades. Her expertise informed strategic planning that addressed how technological advancement was changing the nature of terrorism and asymmetric warfare. The recognition that came with Sarah's international prominence included honors from governments throughout the democratic world, acknowledging her contributions to counter-terrorism efforts that had saved countless lives and prevented attacks on civilian infrastructure and government institutions. President Elizabeth Carter had presented Sarah with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, recognizing her service to national security that exceeded the requirements of duty and demonstrated exceptional courage in facing threats from hostile organizations. The ceremony was conducted at a secure location due to ongoing security concerns about Sarah's safety. Prime Minister David Harrison of the United Kingdom had awarded Sarah the Order of the British Empire for her contributions to international security cooperation that had prevented terrorist attacks throughout Europe. The recognition reflected appreciation for expertise that had protected British citizens and infrastructure from organized criminal violence. Chancellor Angela Hoffmann of Germany had honored Sarah with the Federal Cross of Merit, acknowledging her role in developing analytical methods that had disrupted weapons trafficking networks throughout Central Europe. The award ceremony included representatives from multiple intelligence agencies that had benefited from Sarah's training and consultation. The international recognition had transformed Sarah from a hidden federal consultant into a visible symbol of how individual expertise could affect global security cooperation. Her story was studied in intelligence training programs as an example of how technical knowledge could provide strategic advantages in asymmetric conflicts. Universities throughout allied nations had established research programs based on Sarah's methodology, developing academic curricula that would train future analysts in weapons trafficking intelligence. Her influence on educational institutions ensured that her expertise would be preserved and expanded through scholarly research and instruction. The Sarah Chen Institute for Weapons Intelligence had been established at Georgetown University, with federal funding that supported research into emerging threats from weapons trafficking networks. The institute attracted students from around the world who sought training in analytical methods that Sarah had pioneered. Professor Michael Rodriguez, who directed the institute, had been one of Sarah's first students during her early federal training programs. His academic career had been built on research that extended Sarah's technical analysis into broader studies of how criminal organizations adapted military technology for terrorist applications. "Your methodology has created an entirely new field of academic study," Rodriguez explained during the Institute's inaugural conference. "Students are coming here from 40 countries to learn analytical techniques that didn't exist before your work demonstrated their importance for international security." Sarah's legacy included training programs that were being implemented throughout NATO and allied intelligence services, ensuring that her expertise would continue protecting democratic institutions, even if she were no longer available to provide direct consultation. Her knowledge had been institutionalized through curricula that would train thousands of analysts over coming decades. The weapons trafficking networks that had originally brought Sarah to international attention continued to evolve in response to law enforcement pressure that her work had enabled. Criminal organizations were developing new methods for acquiring and modifying military equipment that required constant adaptation of analytical techniques and investigative approaches. Sarah's current research focused on emerging threats from autonomous weapons systems that criminal organizations were attempting to acquire through cyber attacks on defense contractors and military installations. Her technical expertise was essential for understanding how these weapons could be modified for terrorist applications and developing countermeasures that would prevent their unauthorized use. The briefing room where Sarah now conducted her most classified work was located deep within a facility that didn't appear on any map, protected by security measures that exceeded anything available to civilian organizations. Her daily routine included analysis of intelligence that affected strategic planning at the highest levels of democratic governments. Director James Thompson of the Central Intelligence Agency had assigned Sarah to lead a new initiative that would coordinate weapons intelligence sharing among democratic nations. Recognizing that the threats she'd identified required cooperation that exceeded traditional intelligence partnerships. Her position represented the institutionalization of analytical methods that had proven essential for counterterrorism efforts. The threats that Sarah now analyzed included state-sponsored weapons trafficking that targeted democratic institutions throughout the world, requiring responses that combined technical expertise with diplomatic and military action. Her work affected policy decisions that shaped international relations and security cooperation among allied nations. Sarah's apartment within the secure facility had become a second home that provided safety while enabling her to continue work that protected millions of people from terrorist violence. The isolation was difficult, but the importance of her contributions made the personal sacrifices worthwhile. Evening communications with field agents throughout the world brought reports of investigations that Sarah's methods had made possible, arrests that had prevented attacks, and intelligence that would guide future operations against criminal organizations that threatened democratic societies. The transformation from invisible maintenance technician to international security expert represented a journey that had tested Sarah's commitment to service, while validating the importance of recognizing excellence regardless of where it chose to remain hidden. Her story demonstrated that some capabilities were too valuable to remain permanently concealed when global security required their application. The invisible woman had become permanently visible on the world stage, her expertise recognized and utilized at levels that matched their significance for international security and democratic survival. Sarah's evolution from hidden service to acknowledged leadership represented the completion of a mission that would continue protecting others through the institutions and methods she had created. 5 years after her emergence from the Sacramento Police basement, Sarah stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed International Counterterrorism Intelligence Center in Virginia, watching as representatives from 67 nations gathered for the facility's dedication ceremony. The building represented the culmination of her work in transforming how democratic governments approached weapons trafficking intelligence, creating a permanent institution that would coordinate global responses to evolving threats. The ceremony included heads of state who had traveled from around the world to acknowledge the importance of international cooperation in combating terrorism that transcended national boundaries. President Michael Harrison delivered remarks that credited Sarah's analytical methods with preventing hundreds of attacks and saving thousands of lives across multiple continents. Sarah's role as Director of Global Weapons Intelligence had evolved beyond technical analysis to include strategic oversight of operations that affected geopolitical stability throughout democratic regions. Her daily briefings now included intelligence that shaped military deployments, diplomatic initiatives, and economic sanctions that targeted state sponsors of international terrorism. The personal transformation that accompanied Sarah's professional evolution had been profound but necessary. The woman who had once hidden her capabilities to avoid attention now commanded resources that exceeded those of many small nations, wielding influence that affected policy decisions at the highest levels of international governance. Ambassador Catherine Walsh from the United Nations Counterterrorism Committee approached Sarah during the reception that followed the dedication ceremony. "Your work has fundamentally changed how we understand and respond to asymmetric threats," she observed. "The intelligence sharing protocols you've developed have created cooperation between nations that previously couldn't coordinate their security efforts." Sarah's methodologies had indeed revolutionized international security cooperation by providing technical evidence that transcended political differences and created shared understanding of threats that affected all democratic societies. Her analysis had enabled countries with historical disagreements to cooperate against common enemies that targeted their shared values and institutions. The building itself reflected the scope of Sarah's influence on global security architecture. The facility contained laboratories equipped with technology that exceeded anything available to individual nations, enabling analysis of weapons evidence that required resources only achievable through international cooperation. The research capabilities would ensure that emerging threats could be identified and countered before they materialized into successful attacks. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had succeeded Sarah as Director of Technical Analysis, represented the institutionalization of expertise that would continue protecting democratic societies even as threats evolved beyond current understanding. Her training under Sarah's mentorship had prepared her to lead analytical efforts that would adapt to weapons technologies that criminal organizations would develop in coming decades. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a memorial wall that honored intelligence analysts who had sacrificed their lives in service to international security cooperation. Sarah's name appeared among those recognized for contributions that transcended national loyalty and represented commitment to protecting democratic values regardless of personal cost or professional risk. The reception that followed brought together intelligence professionals from around the world who had implemented Sarah's methods within their own agencies. Their conversations revealed the global impact of analytical techniques that had originated from Sarah's observations in a police basement, but had evolved into standard procedures for counterterrorism operations worldwide. Colonel Maria Santos from Brazil's intelligence agency described how Sarah's training had enabled her country to identify weapons trafficking networks that were supplying criminal organizations throughout South America. The technical signatures that Sarah had taught analysts to recognize had revealed connections between incidents that had previously appeared unrelated, enabling coordinated responses that dismantled criminal networks spanning multiple countries. Inspector Chen from Singapore's Internal Security Department explained how Sarah's methodology had transformed their approach to analyzing weapons recovered from terrorist suspects. The analytical protocols had provided evidence that connected local criminal organizations to international networks, enabling arrests that prevented attacks on civilian infrastructure and government facilities. The conversations revealed that Sarah's influence extended far beyond the immediate impact of preventing specific attacks. Her methods had created institutional changes within intelligence agencies that would continue protecting societies for generations, ensuring that the expertise she had developed would persist and evolve as threats changed and adapted. Sarah's personal life had stabilized within the secure environment that her position required, but the isolation remained a constant challenge that she managed through relationships with colleagues who shared similar security constraints and understood the psychological demands of classified employment at the highest levels of international cooperation. Dr. James Mitchell, who served as the facility's deputy director, had become Sarah's closest professional partner and personal confidant. Their relationship had developed over years of working together on operations that required absolute trust and shared understanding of classified information that affected global security. Mitchell's background in military intelligence and academic research in international relations complemented Sarah's technical expertise, creating a partnership that had proven invaluable in managing operations that required both analytical precision and strategic understanding of geopolitical implications. The evening routine that Sarah had established within the secure facility included communications with field agents and analysts throughout the world who needed consultation about investigations that were developing in real time. Her expertise remained essential for operations that couldn't proceed without someone who understood the technical implications of evidence that exceeded normal analytical capabilities. Sarah's apartment within the facility had become a comfortable home that provided safety while enabling her to maintain relationships with family members who understood that her work required security measures, but couldn't be informed about specific threats or operational details. The facility's recreational areas enabled social interaction with colleagues who shared similar professional constraints. The weekends often brought visits from former students who had completed Sarah's training programs and were implementing her methods within their own agencies. These consultations provided Sarah with satisfaction that came from seeing her expertise multiplied through others who were protecting their own societies using knowledge that she had developed and shared. Lieutenant General Patricia Johnson from the Defense Intelligence Agency had requested Sarah's assessment of emerging threats from artificial intelligence systems that criminal organizations were attempting to acquire for weapons applications. The technical challenges of understanding how these systems could be modified for terrorist purposes required expertise that only Sarah possessed. The research that Sarah now directed included development of analytical methods for threats that didn't yet exist, but which technical advancement would inevitably create. Her ability to anticipate how criminal organizations would adapt to new technologies was essential for preparing defensive measures that would prevent future attacks. The facility's educational programs attracted students from military academies, intelligence services, and law enforcement agencies throughout the democratic world. Sarah's instruction remained the foundation of curricula that prepared analysts for challenges that exceeded traditional training parameters and required understanding of how criminal organizations operated across national boundaries. Professor Angela Davis from the Harvard Kennedy School had established a research program that extended Sarah's methodology into academic studies of how weapons trafficking affected international relations and democratic governance. The scholarly work ensured that Sarah's insights would influence policy development for decades beyond her direct involvement. The Sarah Chen Fellowship Program provided funding for graduate students whose research focused on counterterrorism intelligence and weapons trafficking analysis. The fellows conducted studies that extended Sarah's work into areas that her operational responsibilities didn't permit her to explore personally. The international recognition that continued to accumulate reflected the global impact of Sarah's contributions to democratic security cooperation. The United Nations had established an annual award in her honor that recognized analysts whose work exemplified excellence in international intelligence cooperation and technical innovation. The European Union had created the Chen Protocol for Weapons Intelligence Sharing, establishing procedures that enabled member nations to coordinate responses to trafficking networks that operated across national boundaries. The protocol had become the model for similar agreements in other regions where democratic nations faced common threats. The facility's memorial garden provided space for reflection about colleagues who had been lost during operations that Sarah's work had made possible. The garden included representatives from every nation that participated in international counterterrorism cooperation, acknowledging sacrifices that transcended national identity and represented commitment to shared values. Sarah's daily routine now included strategic planning sessions that affected military deployments and diplomatic initiatives throughout regions where weapons trafficking threatened democratic stability. Her technical expertise informed policy decisions that shaped international relations and security cooperation among allied nations. The evening briefings brought intelligence from field operations that were developing across multiple continents, requiring Sarah's analysis of weapons evidence that would determine how investigations proceeded and what resources would be allocated to counter emerging threats. The transformation that had begun in a police basement had culminated in Sarah's leadership of international efforts that protected millions of people from terrorist violence. Her journey from invisible maintenance technician to global security leader demonstrated how individual expertise could affect historical outcomes when circumstances required revelation of capabilities that had remained hidden. The secure communications that ended each day brought reports from analysts who were implementing Sarah's methods in operations throughout the world. Their success in preventing attacks and dismantling criminal networks validated the importance of recognizing and utilizing excellence regardless of where it chose to serve. The facility's observation deck provided Sarah with a perspective that encompassed the global reach of operations that her expertise had made possible. The lights of Washington, D.C. stretched toward horizons that included nations throughout the world, where analysts trained in her methods were protecting democratic societies from threats that would have seemed impossible to counter before her emergence from anonymity. The Invisible Woman had become the architect of global security cooperation that would protect democratic values for generations. Sarah's evolution from hidden service to acknowledged leadership represented the completion of a mission that would continue through institutions and methods that ensured her expertise would persist long beyond her individual contributions. The dedication ceremony had concluded, but the work would continue through thousands of analysts who carried forward knowledge that had originated from Sarah's observations and insights. Her legacy was embedded in procedures and institutions that would adapt to emerging threats, while maintaining the analytical rigor that had made international cooperation possible. Sarah's story would be studied in intelligence training programs as an example of how individual courage and expertise could transform global security architecture. Her emergence from the shadows had illuminated the importance of recognizing talent regardless of where it chose to remain hidden, demonstrating that excellence often waited patiently for circumstances that required its revelation. The secure facility that bore her name would continue protecting democratic societies through research and analysis that anticipated threats before they materialized into attacks. The international cooperation that Sarah had fostered would persist through agreements and protocols that enabled nations to work together against common enemies. The woman who had once assembled rifles in a police basement now directed operations that spanned the globe. Her expertise multiplied through institutions and individuals who carried forward her mission of protecting others through technical excellence and unwavering commitment to democratic values. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.